The sun went down beneath the long dark lines of hill and cloud, which piled up in the west an airy city. Wall heaped on wall, and battlement on battlement, the light was all withdrawn. The shining church turned cold and dark, the stream forgot to smile, the birds were silent, and the gloom of winter dwelt on everything. An evening wind uprose too, and the slighter branches cracked and rattled as they moved in skeleton dances to its moaning music. The withering leaves, no longer quiet, hurried to and fro in search of shelter from its chill pursuit. The labourer unyoked his horses, and with head bent down trudged briskly home beside them, and from the cottage windows lights began to glance and wink upon the darkening fields. Then the village forge came out in all its bright importance. The lusty bellows roared ha-ha to the clear fire, which roared in turn and bade the shining sparks dance gaily to the merry clinking of the hammers on the anvil. The gleaming iron in its emulation sparkled too, and shed its red-hot gems around profusely. The strong smith and his men dealt such strokes upon their work as made even the melancholy night rejoice, and brought a glow into its dark face as it hovered about the door and windows, peeping curiously in above the shoulders of a dozen loungers. As to this idle company, there they stood, spellbound by the place, casting now and then a glance upon the darkness in their rear, settled their lazy elbows more at ease upon the sill, and leaned a little further in, no more disposed to tear themselves away than if they had been born to cluster round the blazing hearth like so many crickets. Out upon the angry wind, howl from sighing, it began to bluster round the merry forge, banging at the wicket, grumbling in the chimney, as if it believed the jolly bellows were doing anything to order. And what an impotent swaggerer it was too, for all its noise, for if it had any influence on the horse companion, it was but to make it roar his cheerful song aloud, and by consequence to make the fire burn the brighter, and the sparks to dance more gaily yet. At length they whizzed so madly round and round that it was too much for such a surly wind to bear, so off it flew with a howl, giving the old sign before the alehouse door such a cuff as it went, that the blue dragon was more rampant than usual ever afterwards, and indeed before Christmas reared clean out of its crazy frame. It was a small tyranny for a respectable wind to go wreaking its vengeance on such poor creatures as the fallen leaves, but this wind happening to come up with a great heap of them just after venting its humour on the insulted dragon, did so disperse and scatter them that they fled away pell-mell, some here, some there, rolling over each other, whirling round and round upon their thin edges, taking frantic flights into the air, and playing all manner of extraordinary gambols in the extremity of their distress. Nor was this enough for its malicious fury. Not content with driving them abroad, it charged small parties of them and hunted them into the wheelwright's saw pit, and below the planks and timbers into the yard, and scattering the sawdust in the air, it looked for them underneath, and when it did meet with any, how it drove them on and followed at their heels. The scared leaves only flew the faster for all this, and a giddy chase it was, for they got into unfrequented places where there was no outlet, and where their pursuer kept them eddying round and round at his pleasure, and they crept under the eaves of houses and clung tightly to the sides of hayricks like bats, and tore in at open chamber windows and cowered close to hedges, and, in short, went anywhere for safety. But the oddest feat they achieved was to take advantage of the sudden opening of Mr. Pecksniff's front door, to dash wildly into his passage, whither the wind following close upon them, and finding the back door open, incontinently blew out the lighted candle held by Miss Pecksniff, and slammed the front door against Mr. Pecksniff, who was at that moment entering with such violence that in the twinkling of an eye he lay on his back at the bottom of the steps. Being by this time weary of such trifling performances, the boisterous rover hurried away rejoicing, roaring over moor and meadow, hill and flat, till it got out to sea, where it met with other winds similarly disposed, and made a night. In the meantime, Mr. Pecksniff, having received from a sharp angle in the bottom step of one that sort of knock on the head which lights up for the patient's entertainment, an imaginary general illumination of very bright short sixes, lay placidly staring at his own street door, and it would seem to have been more suggestive in its aspect than street doors usually are, for he continued to lie there rather a lengthy and unreasonable time. without so much as wondering whether he was hurt or no. Neither, when Miss Pecksniff inquired through the keyhole in a shrill voice, which might have belonged to a wind in its teens, "Who's there?" did he make any reply, nor, when Miss Pecksniff opened the door again, and shading the candle with her hand, peered out and looked provokingly round him and about him, and over him, and everywhere but at him, did he offer any remark, or indicate that any manner of the least hint of desire to be picked up. "I see you," cried Miss Pecksniff to the ideal inflictor of a runaway knock. "You'll catch it, sir." Still Mr Pecksniff, perhaps from having caught it already, said nothing. "You're round the corner now," cried Miss Pecksniff. She said it at a venture, but there was appropriate matter in it too, for Mr Pecksniff, being in the act of extinguishing the candles before mentioned pretty rapidly, and of reducing the number of brass knobs on his street door from 400 or 500, which had previously been juggling of their own accord before his eyes in a very novel manner, to a dozen or so, might in one sense have said to be coming round the corner and just turning it. With a sharply delivered warning relative to the cage and constable, the stocks and gallows, Miss Pecksniff was about to close the door again, when Mr Pecksniff, still being at the bottom of the steps, raised himself on one elbow and sneezed. "That voice!" cried Miss Pecksniff. "My parent!" At this exclamation another Miss Pecksniff bounced out of the parlour, and the two Miss Pecksniffs, with many incoherent expressions, dragged Mr Pecksniff into an upright posture. "Pa!" they cried in concert. "Pa, speak! Pa, do not look so wild, my dearest Pa!" But as a gentleman looks, in such a case of all others are by no means under his own control, Mr Pecksniff continued to keep his mouth and his eyes very wide open, and to drop his lower jaw, somewhat after the manner of a toy nutcracker, and as his hat had fallen off, and his face was pale, and his hair erect, and his coat muddy, the spectacle he presented was so very doleful that neither of the Miss Pecksniffs could repress an involuntary screech. "That'll do," said Mr Pecksniff. "I'm better." "He's come to himself," cried the youngest Miss Pecksniff. "He speaks again," exclaimed the others. With these joyful words they kissed Mr Pecksniff on either cheek and bore him into the house. Presently the youngest Miss Pecksniff ran out again to pick up his hat, his brown paper parcel, his umbrella, his gloves, and other small items. And that done, and the door closed, both young ladies applied themselves to tending Mr Pecksniff's wounds in the back parlour. They were not very serious in their nature, being limited to abrasions in what the eldest Miss Pecksniff called the knobby parts of her parents' anatomy, such as his knees and elbows, and to the development of an entirely new organ, unknown to phrenologists, on the back of his head. These injuries having been comforted externally with patches of pickled brown paper, and Mr Pecksniff having been comforted internally with some stiff brandy and water, the eldest Miss Pecksniff sat down to make the tea, which was all ready. In the meantime the youngest Miss Pecksniff brought from the kitchen a smoking dish of ham and eggs, and setting the same before her father, took up her station on a low stool at his feet, thereby bringing her eyes on the level with the tea-board. It must not be inferred from this position of humility that the youngest Miss Pecksniff was so young as to be, as one might say, forced to sit upon a stool by reason of the shortness of her legs. Miss Pecksniff sat upon a stool because of her simplicity and innocence, which were very great, very great. Miss Pecksniff sat upon a stool because she was all girlishness and playfulness and wildness and kittenish buoyancy. She was the most arch and at the same time the most artless creature, was the youngest Miss Pecksniff, that you could possibly imagine. It was her great charm. She was too fresh and guileless, and too full of childlike vivacity, was the youngest Miss Pecksniff, to wear combs in her hair, or to turn it up, or to frizzle it, or braid it. She wore it in a crop, a loosely flowing crop, which had so many rows of curls in it that the top row was only one curl. Moderately buxom was her shape, and quite womanly too, but sometimes, yes sometimes, she even wore a pinafore. And how charming